Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the 13th chapter in the book of Romans. It's a chapter of 14 verses, which can be divided into categories of two, each of which is 7 verses in length. And the first 7 verses speaks of the law of man, and the 8th through 14th verses speaks of the law of love. We'll get to the latter when we get to it. We have to attend to the logically prior priority, which is the law of man. Now, government has always, Christianity, the church and the government have always existed in uneasy tension, but it doesn't have to be that way. And the reason it got off to a rocky start is because Christians were sneaky. The rulers had this, the Romans took at face value the title king. They interpreted it literally, and that was sedition and treason. So when they heard all these people speaking of this king, who, as he clarified before Pontius Pilate when being interrogated by him, he was called the King of the Jews, but he told them that my kingdom is not of this earth, it is of truth, and all that other stuff. We can read that in John 18th chapter. But the Romans in general were a religiously tolerant people. They allowed the Jews to worship their one deity and do their sacrifices at liberty. They subscribed to the ancient polytheistic premise that the gods were to be respected in their jurisdictions and domains, so they let the Israelites worship the God of Israel, Yahweh, as they saw fit. But as the Christian became something distinct from Judaism, they garnered the kind of reputation of troublemakers because they called this dead one, who they insist was risen, king. And so that let them, that automatically attracted the suspicion of the Roman authorities. And they, for this reason primarily, they were also, their ways were so radically at variance with the world that they just kind of naturally made easy scapegoats. But what Paul suggests here, what he actually communicates a command from Yahweh, he defines nature as divinely, government as divinely ordained, and to resist it is to resist Elohim himself, who ordained it. So there comes a time when we have to be uncompromising towards the state. That's whenever they interfere with the free election or free exercise of religion. So if they demand that we bow down to deities or idols or anything else, or even Islam prayer rugs, that's when we have to take a stand. But on anything that doesn't encroach on Elohim's territory, we are to have implicit trust and faith that it is ordained by him and for our benefit. So we are to give them no reason to think that we are subversive or overthrowing or anything else. So the opening verse reads, "Let every being be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from Elohim, and the authority that exists are appointed by Elohim." This brings us to the third dispensation. So after Adam and Eve were created innocent, they fell, they grew a conscience. That's the second dispensation. And then sometime after the flood, because the very evil which had precipitated the flood was coming back, Yahweh created the dispensation of government, whereby government exists to restrain a man from his wilder impulses, his murderous passions. If we let every man be a law unto themselves, then we could have no human society or civilization. So government does perform, and in fact, godly, vital and function, and we are to respect it as such, and we are to obey it within reason. Even if we don't like it, we have to accept it as the will of Elohim. Even now, Elohim need not answer and is not responsible for the abuses of tyrants, but Daniel lays it on the line to both Nebuchadnezzar and Belteshazzar that they are where they are, or where they were, all because of Elohim. So he who opposes the authority withstands the institution of Elohim, and those who withstand shall bring judgment on themselves. So to oppose or resist or rebel against the state is tantamount to rebellion against the institution of Elohim, which by connection is rebelling against Elohim himself. And And to do so is to provoke judgment both from the earthly authorities and the divine one. So there's no reason for revolution or rebellion in the divine scheme of things. For those ruling are an object of fear, not to good works, but to evil. Do you want to not be afraid of the authority? Do good, and you shall have praise from it. So they're to give the state no example of actual disobedience. So they are to do no evil before them, so that no evil can be spoken of them. That way they gain the trust of the government, and are able to do what you do. So government really exists for the fear of evil people, because it exists to restrain man's ineradicably evil nature from its own excesses. So it does. But it's more specifically to the verse, it's an object of fear to those who are wicked, because they're the ones with stuff to hide, and they're the ones who don't want consequences for their action, because they know their actions are evil. For it is a servant of Elohim to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword in vain. For it is a servant of Elohim, a revenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. So government and judgment and authority and all the instruments of the state are likened to servants of Elohim. So every earthly authority receives its authority from the supremely sovereign one. Now, a lot of his designs and chessboards may not make sense to us at the moment, but we do have implicit faith that all will be well. And the sword would have been the symbol of Roman might and power. That's how they punished malefactors. That and the cross for the worst of the worst. But, the sword, only the evil, the one who is acting against the state, the one who is resisting and rebelling, because they don't even know that the depraved criminal doesn't even know that he's warring against God himself, but that's the way it is, and he has to bear the consequences nonetheless. So the wrath will come on him who practices evil. Rare is the malefactor who escapes punishment from the government they betray or undermine. And it's absolutely impossible to escape the divine wrath in the afterlife if you do not repent or come to the cross. Therefore it is necessary to be subject, not only because of wrath, but also because of the conscience. So he's saying it's the mandatory obligation is to obey every order of the state that does not interfere with God. So we respect, even if they do not respect that their authority is from God, we have to respect it. So a lot of wicked tyrants are estranged from God, and the earth and the world and its system are somewhat subjected to Satan and sin, but it's still divinely ordained. So the allowance of the existence of evil takes us into territory we'd do well to avoid if we have the suspicion that there's any element or taint of lack of love, and we're going to get to the law of love soon in Elohim. But also the conscience, so this ties into the third dispensation and the second dispensation here connect. So Paul, he could live with his conscience if he knew that he obeyed, and that is a peace of mind that he wanted to pass to Christians. So lesson learned, obey the law not because you have to, but because you want to. It's a good for peace of mind and serenity. For because of this you also pay taxes, for they are servants of Elohim, attending continually to those duties. So the realities of government and the earth in which it lives mandates that the citizens who benefit it pay something back in the form of taxes to it. And this was a controversy which the Herodians and the Pharisees, many of whom took it as a point of pride to resist taxes, because the Pharisees were intensely nationalistic and patriotic. So what the Herodians did was had an unlikely conspiracy. They were the agents of Rome. Herod owed his power to Rome, so they tried to trap him with the question, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? And he does acknowledge much of what he says overlaps with Paul here. Pay unto Caesar what is Caesar's, give unto God what is God's. So, we have both priorities, and obviously the latter is the primary one. But while we're here, within every reasonable potential situation, we should obey the law for the sake of our soul as well as the sake of society. Render therefore to all what is due to them, tax to whom tax, toll to whom toll, fear to whom fear, respect to whom we respect. Now we need not respect the officer, but we must always respect the office. So a lot of times, we've all dealt with obnoxious cops. I personally dealt with correctional officers. Those are some of the worst people on the earth, let me tell you. But it's difficult and challenging to respect those who abuse their power, but we still have to respect the office and the authority that it carries and the weight and the consequences they can inflict on us. And, we're not to resist taxes. This was actually a point of pride among early Baptists who resisted that they pay taxes to pay the state churches because they were inextricably wed at the time. The Baptists were pioneers in the religious freedom movement, which actually was a return to the pre-Constantinian church-state dynamic. So, but they would not pay taxes as a point of pride to support that which they did not agree with it. Many of them went to jail. They were willing to pay the price for this principle. But as a general rule, taxes, we should pay them. There's no reason not to, especially not only for the consequences, but just because this book tells us to. Owe no one anything except to love one another, for he who loves another has filled the law. So he goes from speaking of the law with the lowercase l to the law, the capital L, the Torah of Moses. This is the binding ethical code of the Hebrew people. And by the New Testament, the great debate amongst the rabbinic schools was which one was the greatest one. And the master simplified it to two simple ones: love God, love man with all thy heart, everything, and love thy fellow neighbor as thyself. So he combined Deuteronomy 6:5 and Leviticus 18. So the purpose of the law is not to to be minded to the minutia, but to actually love. And so he elaborates on this by reciting familiar commandments. Now, when a law is presented, little known fact, there are 365 negative prohibitions in the Mosaic law, and there are which translates as thou shalt nots, and 248 positive precepts, which translate as thou shalts. So the reason that the negative outweigh the positive is because man is a fallen creature. We need to be told what not to do to restrain our impulses, much like government, so than we need to be told what to do. But in all things we are to love, and our love for our Heavenly Father will be reflected should be reflected in our interactions with man. And I don't personally believe if one doesn't like their fellow man, I question to what extent they really love their Father in heaven, because in my experience and observation, my love has grown in simultaneous proportion. That's just me. So the 9th verse reads, "For this you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. And if there is any other command, it is summed up in this one word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself." So Paul's reciting and regurgitating essentially the moral law, the final 6 ones of the Decalogue, although not in the order, or actually, everyone except to, honor and respect thy parents. So then the order, do not commit adultery. Obviously, that's a sexual sin, and a breach of faith between the institution of marriage, which is also ordained of God. So a breach of marriage is as much a sin as a breach of a citizen to the state which protects him and to whom he belongs. You shall not murder. Obviously, you can't be going around killing people. There's just no that's not the way we were designed to live, simply put. You shall not steal. Obviously, the maintenance of society demands that a person be safe in their possessions and not have to worry about others taking the fruits of their labor. Sadly, the government are the real thieves in the world we live, but that we should also be protected from the petty thieves, and that's one of the functions that government does. So there we have it. You shall not bear false witness. No one likes a liar. Lying tears asunder the fabric of society and relationships. And you shall not covet. Coveting's really where it all begins. The others are actions. Coveting is an attitude. So when I see my neighbor's wife and I lust after her with my eyes, that's the impulse which leads to the action of adultery. When when someone takes something that was precious to me and I develop a sort of murderous passion, that can be rooted in covetousness, conceivably. When we covet our neighbor's treasure or even that of a stranger, if we covet it to an idolatrous extent, we will inevitably steal. And, so they all, pretty much all of them stem from coveting. But you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The negative is summed up in a positive. He says it right here. Any other command. So this, what you read, and also any other. So the whole range of the Torah is summed up. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, to love oneself is not a commandment because it is natural to all. The natural man is in love with himself and thinks his own needs, wants, and concerns and appetites the object of all good, and there's nothing unchristian about loving yourself enough to respect yourself, to eat well, to live well, to sleep well, to make sure you have comfortable habitations. But we should also be like-minded. It's not all about us. We should, try and make everyone else's world a little more rosy, and that is the manifestation of love in action. Love does no evil to a neighbor. Therefore, love is a completion of the Torah. So because love thinks no evil and does no evil, it does not entertain the thought of evil, because such thoughts are foreign to that which is love, as defined by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 13:14. It is totally devoid of any trace of selfishness. So you're not going to do evil unless it's selfishly motivated. So when you love your neighbor, you're not going to want to steal from them. You're not going to want to spit on their floor. You're not going to want to spit on their face. You're not going to do anything disrespectful to them. And so you wouldn't spit in your own face. So why would you spit in your neighbor's? But love is the completion of the law. So all the thou shalts are summed up into one positive precept. Thou shalt, and love is the element, the key, and the glue of our religion. So that is the law of love summed up. Here I kind of exaggerated earlier when I said that eventually he kind of breaks away from the law of love, but what he has to say is important. And this, knowing the time, that it is already the hour for us to wake up from sleep. For now our salvation is nearer than when we did believe. So he's talking about the second coming. So Paul and much of the apostolic generation lived with the expectation that he could return any moment. And tragically, that fire has sort of died out and winnowed down through the ages. But, he had this sense that his salvation was near, and it was coming close. It was imminent, even though it wouldn't be at least 2,000 years. Here we are, and we're getting closer. But the dispensation of the latter days really began with the dawn of the apostolic era. So that expectation, the promise of his return, is what has sort of defined every year in the dispensation since his death. Wake up from sleep, that means we're going to rise from the dead. Sleep is analogous to dead. The night is far advanced, the day has come near, so let us put off the works of darkness, and let us put on the armor of light. So with the imminence of the return, we have all the incentive we need to clothe ourselves and to purify ourselves, to bask ourselves in light, and to not be subsumed by the darkness, which is literally all around us. So we have this challenge in waiting for the world to come while we are in the world we live in. And the way to do that is to bask in the light, that is the purity and divinity, and not succumb to the darkness, which is the sinful temptation all around us and sometimes within us. Let us walk becomingly, as in the day, not in wild parties, in drunkenness, not in living together, in indecencies, not in fighting and envy. So this is a historically significant verse because the story of St. Augustine, the 3rd century Catholic Christian icon, was, he was educated in Platonic thought and everything else. He was a pagan, but his mother was a Christian, and he was living a hedonistic life. He was intellectually stimulated, but he couldn't find any lasting satisfaction, so he was living a life of hedonism until one day he heard a voice of an angel or divinity himself telling him to open the book. The book was talking to him, and he turned right to this passage, read that verse, wept in tears, and really changed his life, and in so doing, changed history and the faith as we know it. So there is a better way than the hedonistic, that is the way of the darkness in the world. We who bask in the light are to avoid that stuff. There's no reason, our sinful nature has been crucified on the cross, so that stuff doesn't have the idea, or the temptation doesn't have the same salience it did before we were redeemed. So with redemption comes responsibility, not to return or succumb to the tyrannical nature of the old self. But put on the Master Yahweh, Yahshua Messiah, and make no provision for the lust of the flesh. Paul elsewhere comments on the dichotomy between the flesh and the lust, the spirit and the lust, in the 8th chapter of this book, the 5th chapter of Galatians, and he was actually influenced by Greek and Platonic thought, who kind of, really made that division, but it did creep into and influence Christianity. So, the remedy is the Messiah, who was flesh, but his flesh never succumbed to sin, and because his spirit always ruled his flesh. So his flesh, for example, yearned out to let this cup, the cross and the crucifixion, pass from me, but nevertheless, not as I will, thine will be done. So we have there is a window of the screaming of his flesh to avoid the pain which had to come, but the spirit was willing to dominate the flesh, which was crying out against the Father's will. So that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. See you then. Bye-bye.